Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have journalist Andrew Feinberg with us today. We'll chat with Andrew in just a second. But first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Andrew Feinberg has been a journalist in the nation's capital for nearly 2 decades and is currently the White House correspondent for The Independent, covering the executive branch, Congress, campaigns, and political investigations across the United States. He was the first journalist to report on the exact timing of the unprecedented first federal indictment of Donald Trump back in June of 2023. He also broke the story on the Trump White House social media monitoring operation that gave Trump's aides advance warning of plans for violence on January 6, 2021. His work has also appeared in Political Magazine, Newsweek, Washington Business Journal, The Hill, and Communications Daily. Andrew, welcome into the back room.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, last week, Donald Trump announced Liberation Day with regard to his tariffs. What exactly have we been liberated from except about $10 trillion in equity?
I think that's what we've been liberated from. Also, possibly leadership in the global economy, having the world's reserve currency, being a trusted place to invest money, all of those things. Liberated.
Yeah. What do you make of this week's market whiplash? Traders are clearly still unhappy, despite Wednesday's historic market gains. The market tanked just one day later. Today, it's a little bit seesawy. What do you think traders went to bed with Wednesday night and woke up to Thursday morning and decided for themselves?
I think what has happened is that traders who got that brief sugar high from hearing that Trump put the 90-day pause on the more egregious of all the tariffs, but still left in place a 10% tax on everything imported for Americans to pay, they woke up hungover and realized, oh my God, there's still a 10% sales tax on everything that's higher than we've had since the 1930s. And also, this is all on the whims of one guy who could change his mind tomorrow. And why the hell should I keep my money in equities when he could pull the rug out from us again for any reason?
You know, we still have the auto tariffs, the steel and aluminum tariffs, and with China, 145% was revised upward yesterday, 145%. And we import 14% of our imports come from China, which is why you're seeing warnings coming out of places like Walmart. So you're saying traders woke up and were like, wait a second, we're still in a very, very precarious position.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. And those tariffs, the China 145%, let me explain something. When Donald Trump talks about tariffs, he always says, I got China to pay more tariffs than any president had ever paid. That is ridiculous and wrong. China is not paying tariffs. Tariffs are not tribute. They are not entry fees paid for the privilege of having your products in U.S. markets. That's not what it is. A tariff is a sales tax. It's an import tax. So, quintessential example, I like fountain pens. And maybe last March, I bought a fountain pen from a small manufacturer based in Belgium. And they had it sent to me by DHL, and I was tracking it and watching it fly across the ocean and land here. And I got an email from DHL saying, we need to collect an import tax from you because it was over a certain value. So I had to pay a very small amount of money to DHL because DHL had paid that import tax.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened to me last year when I bought my cool pen is going to happen to everything that comes in from China.
Mm-hmm.
And so what will eventually happen is those taxes will trickle down in the form of higher prices. And if everyone is having to deal with a 145% tariff, that means that the price of everything that is imported from China is going to more than double. And this is not sustainable.
If you go to Target or Walmart and you buy a $20 dress for your toddler daughter, it's going to cost like $50. I mean, it's crazy.
That's exactly what's happening.
I don't think people understand yet. Tariffs, trade wars, these are very complicated things, even for guys like us who have a fairly decent understanding of it. For the average person, it's not real until it's real, until you're actually holding up that dress in Walmart and going, wait a second, this can't be $50.
Well, let's be clear about something. The reason a lot of people don't understand is not only because tariffs are something that most people learned about in history books as something that the U.S. mostly left behind after the Great Depression, but there has been a concerted campaign to lie to people.
Right. Which is what you just said about countries paying, paying, not the importer or the consumer.
Right. This has been going on for a full decade now that Donald Trump has been an actor on the political main stage. It has been going on since 2015, the way he has talked about tariffs. And people in his administration will point to the first term when he put comparatively limited tariffs on aluminum and steel, in particular from China. And they will say there wasn't runaway inflation when that happened. Well, there is a big difference between those 20% taxes on imported raw steel and raw aluminum and a 145% import tax on everything. It is not an honest apples to apples comparison, and it's absurd. And the way that people have consumed information about this for the last 10 years, it's going to result in them taking a big financial hit because a lot of them heard what Donald Trump was saying about tariffs, and they either did not understand because he's lied about tariffs for the last 10 years about other countries paying them, or they were distracted by a lot of other things that he was saying. And it's really unfortunate because we are all collectively in the U.S. going to pay for it, but also possibly around the world, because what we're seeing right now is a shockwave echoing throughout the global economy. And it's going to have very long-term consequences because what is happening is Donald Trump is in a way blowing up the system of relatively free trade that the United States helped establish after World War II on the idea that countries that trade with each other without a ton of barriers such as tariffs usually don't get into shooting wars with each other. And this was informed in particular by the experience of Pearl Harbor. What had led up to it was a series of trade disputes that eventually led to Japan feeling that they needed to hit the United States militarily because we were cutting off their energy supplies. So these things have consequences. There is a reason things have been the way they have been the last 80 years. And the reason that Donald Trump is blowing them up, a lot of it is fantasy land and crack pottery, and a lot of it is just a lack of understanding about why things are the way they are.
So let's stick with his Wednesday announcement of the 90-day pause. This was not a victory by a deal-making genius, as he and the administration and his sycophants have portrayed it as, but rather a capitulation. So what happened? Was it the overnight bond meltdown?
From what I understand through the reporting I've been able to do, yes. It's a classic example of touching the hot stove. And you're a little kid. I don't know if you grew up with those old-style electric burners in your house, but when your mom turned on the electric burner, it glowed red. And you thought, oh my God, that looks cool. I want to touch it. And your mom told you, don't touch it. And either you listened to your mom or you touched it and you got burned and you probably didn't do it again. This was touching the hot stove. And the burn was the bond market, the U.S. bond market bottoming out overnight. And that finally got through to Donald Trump because his economic advisors, and in particularly Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, could not hide that from him. There's no hand waving it away. There's no talk about how this is a market overreaction. because the bond market has serious consequences for the entire U.S. economy, because at least for now, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And at least until now, U.S. Treasury securities, bonds, have been a safe haven for investors, not just in the U.S., but around the world. It's how the government raises most of its money, because we run a deficit in our federal government. And so what happened there was red flashing lights, got to do something, because it looks like people are going to start dumping treasuries. And that's still happening, unfortunately, but not in the alarming way it was up until Wednesday.
So my nickname is Optimistic Andy, because I try to always find the silver lining in things. And so should we take some comfort from what you just said, in that, yes, even Donald Trump has his limitations, that he is able to either see on his own that he's about to create a catastrophe, or that he remains open to whoever happens to have a half a brain in their head who's around him and can get through to him. And so there is some guardrail here, that he's not going to push it to the point of no return. Should we be encouraged by what happened here?
I'm going to say yes and no. Let me see if I can walk you through this a bit more granularly. Yes, because at the end of the day, he does understand that there's some things that you can't hand wave away and you can't just ignore, such as the cratering market for treasury bonds, which also affects the interest rates and causes the U.S. to have to pay more to bondholders, and that over the long term is very bad. So yes, Donald Trump caved to reality. He listened finally to Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, who had been sort of pushed to the side in favor of Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Peter Navarro, who is an OG from Trump 1. He's Trump's main trade advisor, who is very hawkish to the point that most mainstream economists think he's a complete crackpot. And so Bessent was able to elbow Navarro and Lutnick aside. Lutnick is an interesting character for many reasons that we don't have time to go into today. But a lot of people say, well, Lutnick's a Wall Street guy, Bessent's a Wall Street guy, and they're kind of the same. They're not the same. They're not the same at all. Bessent is the real deal. Lutnick is not Bessent. I'll put it that way. So yes, he listened finally to Bessent, and Bessent has sort of reasserted himself. But I'm going to say no, you shouldn't feel optimistic for a couple reasons. One, Trump is always influenced by who's in proximity, and Howard Lutnick has made himself a constant presence in the Oval Office. Peter Navarro is always around because Trump likes them. He likes Lutnick. Lutnick's a New Yorker like him. He kind of has that brash, blue-collar-ish background. Not that Donald Trump was ever a blue-collar guy, but his dad was a builder. They're not ivory tower types. And so inevitably, Lutnick will find his way back into the president's ear. Navarro has been sort of shoved aside. They're still sending him out on TV, but Donald Trump is thinking a little bit more before he goes all in with whatever Peter Navarro is suggesting at any given time right now. But the real reason I would say it may not be so good to be optimistic right now, well, a couple reasons. One, if you look at the yields from Treasury bonds, they keep going up. As I was saying, that's bad for the U.S. because it means the government has to pay more interest on bonds, which means less money for other things. Two, if you look at the dollar and the price of gold, they're moving in opposite directions. And investors appear to be taking a second look at the euro and investing in places other than the US. And this is bad because the one thing you could always count on for your entire life and for my entire life has been the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Treasury bonds are a stable, well-regarded place to park money. The government can always borrow more money at reasonable rates because it is known as a safe, reliable investment vehicle. Donald Trump is shattering that reputation. He is completely blowing up America's standing as the safe, boring, reliable place to park your money, because I don't know why, but he's doing it. And unless something happens to really reassure global investors that this is a fluke, that he really learned his lesson from touching that hot tariff stove, I don't see it getting better.
Mm-hmm. So what is his end goal here? Because he seems to have several conflicting goals, such as reshoring manufacturing, raising trillions in tariff revenue, and reducing universal tariffs to very low, quote unquote, fair levels. But he can't have all of that, can he?
No, he cannot. They're inherently in conflict with each other, those things. If you look at Donald Trump's history as a public figure, he kind of came onto the scene in the late 70s, the early to mid 80s, the age of Studio 54, when the U.S. was coming out of the 70s oil shock from the Arab oil embargo and stagflation and all of that. This was the Gordon Gekko greed is good era. And at that same time, although maybe this was a little more into the mid to late 80s, early 90s, but still the same general period, everyone started freaking out about Japan being the big rising economic power that was going to completely take over everything. And this is because people were buying Japanese cars. People weren't buying as many American cars. Japanese industries were ascendant. You had Sony with the Walkman and other things like that. You had Japanese investors spending a lot of money in the U.S. In one famous instance, I believe they bought part of Rockefeller Center. This caused a lot of agita among a certain class of business people, and Donald Trump was one of those people. And if you look at his appearances from the 1980s when he talked about trade and tariffs, he was saying largely the same things that he was saying today, that he is saying today. And, you know, other countries are taking advantage of us. And they're laughing at us, and our leaders are very stupid because they're letting, you know, other countries eat our lunch. And he is who he is, who he is. He does not change. His views don't change. These are the views he has always had and probably always will have. What has changed since the 1980s, 1990s is the world has become more integrated in terms of global supply chains. North American supply chains have become integrated, especially for things like cars, where once you had American cars manufactured entirely in America, now American cars might be made in America, but parts might be made in Mexico, might be made in Canada, might cross the border to be made into larger like sub-assemblies and then sent back across one border or across another border. And by the time they're finally assembled, these parts may have gone from the U.S. to Mexico to Canada, to Mexico to the U.S. to Mexico to Canada, back to the U.S. And that's how the car gets made. With semiconductors, parts, you know, some of these semiconductor parts may be made in Taiwan or elsewhere and then shipped to the U.S. And those things are put into American-made components for things. It is not like it was. And Trump has this fantasy that somehow he's going to entice all of these companies to reshore manufacturing back to the U.S. and revive the entire American Rust Belt like it's the 1950s again. And it's a nice idea, but the problem with it is there is a lot of manufacturing in the U.S. still, and a lot of manufacturing has come back, and manufacturing has gone up in many sectors in recent years, but it's not like it was. You know, you're not going to have a car that is entirely made from parts built in the U.S., starting from the raw metals. That just isn't happening. It's not how anything works anymore. And for the most part, that's a good thing because it allows American companies to focus on what they're good at, using the skilled labor that we have to do things that only we can do. And these other countries that have different skill sets and different facilities are doing the things that we need to be done cheaper. And for the most part, these are allies. You know, take China out of the equation. And these are countries that we are friendly with, that we are, in fact, very close to. And Donald Trump talks about these allies like they are our enemies and trying to hurt the U.S. And again, this is not how anything works, but he has a fixed worldview, and this is how it's expressing itself.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, even if we give him the benefit of the doubt and that he has a sound global economic manufacturing worldview, I mean, we're talking investment of trillions of dollars, upwards of about 20 years to be able to reshore manufacturing the way he's talking about. And then when you throw in the labor structure and the cost effectiveness or lack thereof of having American workers do the kind of cheap labor that other countries like China are able to do, it really does almost make this comical that he thinks we can go back to this era.
What's even weirder about it is that in his mind, he thinks people would want to go back to that era. So I'll give you the prototypical example here. The immigrant worker who comes to the U.S. in the 1940s or 1930s and works in a garment factory, a sweatshop, horrible conditions and all that. And they have a child and they slave away in this garment factory so their child can get a better job, an education and a better job in an automobile factory, assembly line, unionized. But that factory worker, they don't necessarily want their kid to grow up and do the exact same thing. They want their kid to go to college and become a doctor or a lawyer. And what Donald Trump is talking about is reviving a world where you have generations of people doing this factory work that even the people who did that factory work didn't necessarily want their kids to follow in their footsteps. They wanted more for their kids. And, I never knew my maternal grandfather. He was an immigrant, came from, I think it's now part of Ukraine, but I'm not quite sure. But he worked his butt off and he ran a dry cleaning business. And my mother became an attorney. And, I'm a journalist. I cover the White House. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that Donald Trump understands that parents who aren't already incredibly wealthy, such as himself, who work these sorts of jobs, want their kids to do better than they did. And there's a quote from John Adams, and he said, "I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain." Mm-hmm. And I don't know many people who are studying, tapestry and porcelain these days. But that, in a nutshell, is the thing that Donald Trump appears to be missing in the way he talks about reshoring manufacturing. Mm-hmm. That, for the most part, people don't want to go back to working in factories. And even if they did go back to working in those factories, even if you revived those factories in the 1950s way of manufacturing, which, by the way, the reason the 1950s economy worked so well the way it did is because the rest of the world had been bombed to rubble and not the United States.
Right.
The Second World War just ended. But even if you brought that back, parents don't necessarily want their kids to go work in the factory with them. It's not like LeBron James wanting to play basketball alongside his son. It's them wanting their kids to grow up and go to school.
Yeah.
And study so they don't work in the factory.
Right, exactly.
And so this is the insanity of it all.
This may be a hard question for you to answer, but it's something that is rooted in my perception and belief of what we've been experiencing since the reign of Trump. And that is a lot of this stuff, it's all integrated with racial animus. Because merely going back to the 50s in the age of manufacturing and the great union jobs, that's not solely what Trump and MAGA world is talking about. They want to go back to the 50s for a lot of reasons, in my opinion, which is when, the rich dudes, the white dudes owned the factories and the peons came to work, and, the Hispanics were in the field and the Jews did your taxes and blacks knew their place and gays were in the closet, blah, blah, blah. There was no trans, there was no pronouns. Make America great again. Like, isn't it all part of the same movement in the minds of these people? And manufacturing is just a part of it. Maybe it's just like the most legit, acceptable way of explaining it all, because they can say, hey, I want to go back to the 50s when blacks knew their place. But they can say, let's go back to the 50s when we had strong manufacturing.
I'm a reporter. I'm not a columnist. I'm not an opinion guy. And I'm not comfortable ascribing, that kind of motive to an economic policy. There are a lot of reasons that people may believe what they believe. I don't necessarily think that that is the root of this. I think with trade, people call Donald Trump racist for a lot of reasons. People attribute racist views to people working for Donald Trump for many reasons. But in terms of this trade and industrial policy stuff, I really don't think that's the case. This is not a euphemism. It's not a metaphor. Donald Trump's views on trade and manufacturing and these sorts of things and tariffs have been fully formed and unchanging for decades. And yeah, there are always going to be people who say, life was better in that period of time. There was a more predictable social order. But Trump's not talking about the social order. He's talking about manufacturing, and he's talking about the fact that there was a time when, men, and it was almost always men, except for during World War II when they were all fighting war, went to work in these great factories in the middle of the country, and they built things. And those things were exported to the rest of the world. And it did make America an economic and manufacturing powerhouse. And a lot of that is because the rest of the world wasn't in a position to produce a good goddamn thing, because the rest of the world was in shambles. And what gets left out of that story is, as the rest of the world recovered from the war, yes, in many cases with American help, they built industries that copycatted us. The Japanese rebuilt their auto industry, and they, in many cases, did things better and smarter than we did because they were building from rubble. And the Germans had always had a very, very good automotive industry, and Europe had always had that. And those cars were always really good. And what eventually happened was America opened her markets, not because our leaders were stupid people or suckers, as Donald Trump likes to say, but because there was a demand for it. That period of time when Trump was coming up as a public figure and everyone was freaking out because people were buying Japanese cars, people were buying Japanese cars because there had just been a massive oil shock, and people wanted smaller cars that were more fuel efficient because they didn't use as much gas. And American car companies, for the most part, were still building land yachts. And that's not our leaders being stupid. That's how the market works. That's your basic Adam Smith right there. Laws of supply and demand. And the one thing, I'm not an opinion guy, but I will give you an opinion here. The one thing I don't understand, this fundamental contradiction. A lot of these people who are saying America is the greatest country in the world, we are the best at everything, we build the best stuff, we have the smartest people, the most innovative minds, are the same people who are saying that the reason Americans are buying foreign products is because we're somehow being tricked or ripped off by other countries, when if you believe the first part of it, that we're the best and we have the best stuff, why can't we compete? Why can we not build the best stuff? If the American stuff is the best, Americans are going to buy it, both because Americans like to buy the best stuff and also because we have national pride. We do. So I don't get the disconnect between, rah-rah, we're the best everything, and also our leaders are stupid because they let all of these foreign countries send their products in, and now Americans are buying them, and we've been tricked and screwed over. I don't get it.
So what was the strategy or the methodology used to put this tariff policy together? Because he also included the herd in McDonald Islands, inhabited only by penguins. Who knew that penguins were on his enemies list?
They're sneaky birds. They really are.
I loved your tweet this morning about that unfortunate copter crash in South Africa.
Caused by a penguin.
Caused by a penguin. And you tweeted what?
This is what happens when you tariff the penguins.
There
they
you
fight
go.
Back.
Don't fuck with the penguins.
No. But a White House official explained to reporters that they were instituting reciprocal tariffs based off of a formula, not simply reciprocity in what tariffs other countries place on American goods, but it was a formula that they were basing on trade deficits, because in this official's words, the trade deficit is the sum of all the cheating. And that there betrays the idiocy within the Trump trade policy brain trust here, because a trade deficit isn't necessarily a result of unfair trade practices. A lot of the time, most of the time, it's the result of market forces. Mm-hmm. One of the countries that we put these incredible tariffs on, I believe, was an impoverished African nation, Lesotho. And Lesotho, yes, we have a huge trade deficit with them. We import billions from them. They don't buy much from us. Do you know why? Because this country's, one of their major exports is diamonds. We buy diamonds from them. And the reason they're not buying diamonds from us or goods from us isn't because we don't have stuff to sell, although we don't have diamonds here. The reason is because that country, for various reasons, is so impoverished that they can't afford American goods. But what they do have, we want. And they buy. And if they had the economic capacity, I'm sure they'd be buying more American stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know you're not an opinion guy. I'll give my opinion on something. But the problem with Trump is that it's an exercise in futility when we try to simplify his positions, or whether or not they're based on anything cohesive or logical. And, you know, we're talking about a person who, with regard to everything, whether it's countries, judges, courts, the media, you name it, everyone is treating him unfairly. Everyone is treating us unfairly. It's all rigged. It's the battle of the us versus them, which is how he keeps his base together. He constantly needs to have an enemy. And so to me, tariffs are just getting rolled up in this. It's just another thing of, look at us, we're getting screwed, we're being treated so unfairly, everybody's treating us so poorly. So I don't know, it's like, sometimes I feel like, why do people like us even try to make heads or tails out of anything he does when it's so rooted in this pathological victimhood and his need to have enemies, so that instead of governing like every other president, he can just rally up the base with the us versus them bullshit?
Well, I think one thing you said there is correct, that his thinking is almost always zero sum. He doesn't really believe in win-win situations. He believes there always has to be a winner and a loser. And that's how he approaches pretty much everything. That's what he's done for decades, long before he went into politics. I mean, he spells it out in his mostly ghostwritten, but still informative into his psyche books. And I think there's one thing that I would disagree with you on, that it isn't a waste of time to look and try to explain, because frankly, a lot of it is the tariff fixation is a product of those formative years when he was the big deal New York real estate guy who was building Trump Tower and was, out and about, man about town at Studio 54 and going on Larry King Live. His glory days, that was when his view of trade was really fully formed, and it hasn't changed since then. But the zero-sum thinking, that's how he approaches almost everything.
Yeah, and I want to just clarify, when I say an exercise in futility, I get why it's critical that we continue to talk about everything he does. I'm just saying, unlike any other president in history,
that's true.
Where does it lead to? Like tomorrow, there could be a tweet from Xi, who says Trump's a great businessman, and tomorrow Trump will be like, you know what? No more tariff on China. It's like, so all the analysis, all the conversation, it's like
that's correct.
Yeah, so it's like conventional wisdom is just completely out the window.
Conventional wisdom, it's not the way things have worked forever because Trump sees international relations in personal terms. He conflates himself with the United States. So if he and Xi get along, then in his mind, the US and China get along. But, that's something that is a departure from the kind of institution-based order that we've lived in for both of our lives and for a lot of our parents' lives, maybe even some of our grandparents' lives. I think that that's a huge change, and it's going to have repercussions, even if things were to go back to the way they were, which of course nothing works that way. The US's image as a reliable hegemon, as a beacon of stability, that's gone. And
is it gone for now, or is it?
I don't.
If Gretchen Whitmer became president in 2028, can we get some of that or a lot of that back fairly quickly?
No.
The way Biden restructured our alliances and NATO and strengthen our position globally?
No. And I'm going to tell you why. Because when Biden won in 2020 and took office in 2021 and said America was back, this was, after voters had shown Trump the door, there had been a riot at the Capitol, and Biden and his people made a fundamental mistake. And this is long before re-election was ever an issue. I'm not going to get into whether he should have run or not. He shouldn't have run. The fundamental mistake was treating Trump as an aberration and not as a warning. And when Biden appointed Merrick Garland as Attorney General, for instance, in an effort to, in his telling, restore normalcy to the Justice Department and not someone with more political acumen. The other candidate for it was Doug Jones, the recently defeated Alabama senator. It was a grievous miscalculation that what America wanted and the world wanted was quiet, boring normalcy instead of a reaction to what had happened and an immune reaction. If the first Trump term was a warning, was a fever in terms of the health of America's democratic institutions, the way Biden came in and went about things was the equivalent of following RFK Jr.'s advice and giving cod liver oil during a measles outbreak. Because Garland's ponderous way of going about some of the investigations into the then former president, now the incumbent once more, he treated those as if the investigations themselves were something to be avoided because of longstanding norms. And those norms had already been violated. And if you compare that to, say, Brazil or South Korea, countries with histories of having come out of military dictatorships, those countries had healthy immune systems because they just removed the guy who tried to declare martial law in South Korea. And in Brazil, the guy who orchestrated a copycat of January 6th is going to be tried for that. And it happened pretty quickly in both cases. And we don't get to go back to the way things were domestically or globally. And Donald Trump has blown up a lot of things. And the next president, say, Gretchen Whitmer or Josh Shapiro, or, if it's a Democrat, whoever it is not going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. They are going to have to make the case that America is going to be a stable economic actor, a good faith actor, and they're going to have to build that trust and confidence up again from scratch. And a lot of that's going to depend on what sort of guardrails are put in place after this presidency to prevent what abuses are going to come to light in the next 4 years and after. And it may require a wholesale rethinking of how this government handles its business in a lot of ways. But my point is that you can't just go back, because look what happened when we tried to go back 4.5, 5 years ago with Biden. It didn't work because you didn't address the underlying problem. And the underlying problem here is that even if the next president resets the clock to January 19th, 2025, what has happened since has still happened. And that's a bell that cannot be unrung.
My last question is with regard to Elon Musk and his role in all of this, because one of the most fascinating, perhaps even most consequential thing to come out of this whole tariff situation is the very public feud that began earlier this week between him and Peter Navarro. I mean, he called Peter Navarro a moron and I think dumb as a ton of bricks. Is there going to be a winner and a loser in that feud? And even more importantly, are we starting to see the signals that the era of Musk is going to be over soon in the administration?
I have no idea. I think one interesting thing about the Musk-Navarro feud is that Musk's view of Navarro, based on my own reporting, is shared by the majority of economists and financial and trade experts in this country and elsewhere. So as Musk likes to say, vox populi, vox dei, in that case. So he may be simply channeling the voice of the people there, but I don't think he goes away as a political force. Mm-hmm. He has hitched his star to the MAGA movement and to Donald Trump and to Republican politics writ large. And even if he leaves the administration, his slash and burn ethic, the hostility towards working people who staff our government agencies, that's going to stay. Because in a way, Musk's move fast and break things by traumatizing government workers ethos is what a lot of Republican MAGA Trump voters I talk to say they voted for. Whether it makes sense or not, they want federal workers who they overwhelmingly see as Democrats who live in Washington, even though the federal workers who work in Washington don't live in Washington. And a lot of them aren't Democrats. And actually, federal employees are distributed throughout the country pretty evenly. They see them at that and they want to hurt them because they blame them for whatever they feel has gone wrong over the last period of years. They just feel angry towards what they call unelected bureaucrats. And so what Musk has done is, I don't like the word normalized, but he has made it acceptable to treat federal employees in a dismissive, callous way. Because usually in a normal, even a Republican administration, there's a realization that there are consequences to these things. That when you gut FEMA, for instance, there are fewer people available to be sent to help when some town in Alabama or Tennessee or Kansas is leveled by tornadoes. Elon Musk doesn't need to understand that because he's never going to be impacted by it because he has more money than God.
Right.
He's insulated from all of it. And that callousness is not going away in this administration because it's built in. Russ Vought, the head of OMB, said he wants federal workers to be traumatized. There is just a hostility to the rank and file that is baked in. And Musk is an expression of that. He has certainly sharpened the rhetoric and coached the administration on how to do things to hurt their targets. And they're using data in new ways to go after disfavored groups. You're seeing it in the way they're using Social Security databases and IRS databases for immigration enforcement and stuff. So Musk will at some point exit. He's limited in how long he can stick around as a special government employee. Even if the president wants to name him as some sort of special advisor for whatever, there are limits to what he can do there. But his methods aren't going anywhere. And his money's not going anywhere because if you look at his output on X, formerly Twitter, the platform he owns, he's really bought into this idea, this fringe idea that, number one, the Democratic Party is fake and is propped up by government support for NGOs that launder their money back into being contributions to Democratic campaigns, things like that. So that's one of the big reasons they got rid of USAID, because of that conspiracy theory. And this other thing that he's still in on, which is the idea that Democratic administrations are importing illegal immigrants to vote for them. And Musk is willing to put his money where his mouth is there and help elect Republicans because he actually believes this stuff. So as long as he's engaged with these fringe conspiracy-addled beliefs, he's going to keep funneling money towards the GOP. Now, whether there's a financial consequence to him from this trade war and that pushes him to go in a different direction, I don't know. But he's going to be here for the long run in one way or another.
Yeah. Well, just to put a punctuation on this, he tried real hard in Wisconsin with his money, and his money didn't really go very far. But Andrew, great conversation, great insights. Do come back and talk with us again soon.
Anytime.
All righty. Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Matty Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Lengyel. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.